Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum Summer Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the Executive Director and founder of the group. I'm thrilled to be joined by today's speaker, Colonel Joseph Molyson, for his third appearance before us. Before I introduce him formally, I just want to cover usual housekeeping items. First, Q&A. As always, our speakers graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read your question out to our speaker, or if you're feeling more adventurous, you can use the raised hand feature, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method you choose, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience in terms of time and substance. Number two, donations are always appreciated. I know we got one or two today, and I'll call them out at the end, so I appreciate that. But not expected. There is a donate tab on the website. Third, we are recording this talk for our social media channel. It'll be posted shortly thereafter on YouTube. You can access this video and all the other ones by going to the website and clicking on the small YouTube icon at the top. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker. Colonel Joseph Molyson is a 30-year U.S. Air Force veteran who spent most of his service in intelligence and retired as a colonel. His previous books are Six Air Forces Over the Atlantic and Air Battles Before D-Day, both published by Stackpole, and both of which we've had the privilege to hear him speak for our group here. He lives outside Atlanta, Georgia. Today he's going to discuss his third book, which is the third of the trilogy here, Thunder Over Normandy, How Allied Airmen Helped Liberate France from D-Day to Paris and Beyond, which tells the story of the air campaign that began on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and culminated in the liberation of France, one of the largest and most complex battles throughout the war, particularly aerial operations. The reviews for this book, like all the others, have been, top rate, stellar, and I think, like I said, everyone's really enjoyed Joe's previous talks. So, with that, I will turn it over to him.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Greg. I hope I earned it.
You have.
The book we're going to be talking about a little bit today is Thunder Over Normandy. It covers the actual Overlord operation. It is the third book in a series I've written, the first one being Six Air Forces Over the Atlantic, which covers the North Atlantic Air Campaign, which secured the lines of communication between North America and much of the British Empire and the metropolitan area of Britain itself. The second book was Air Battles for D-Day, which focused more on the situation in France, on the land, also along the coast, and the preparations that the Allies had to do in order to actually execute a successful invasion. So the area we talk about, I hope you can see my cursor. The area we're talking about for the actual invasion is this area here, Lower Normandy, as the French call it now. The main operation was the seaborne landing was called Neptune. That was the amphibious part of it, the naval part of it, if you will. And then on each flank were airborne landings in the Cotentin Peninsula to the west, which were primarily American aircraft, and the area to the east of Caen, which were executed mainly by RAF aircraft. The overall operation, including the drive into France, was codenamed Operation Overlord. So the book covers the actual Operation Overlord, which began execution on June 4th and lasted until August 31st, 1944. It centers on France, northern France specifically, and the German homeland. I used extensive primary and secondary sources. I was very fortunate to have access to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and also several oral interviews with World War II veterans. I began doing the research in this in the late 1990s, so a lot of the veterans were still alive at that point. You're going to find that a lot of maps in this book. I was an intelligence officer in the Air Force. And I always taught my pilots and my folks who work with me in intelligence to look at the map, because the map tells you 75% of the story of whatever's going on. And essentially, the book tries to explain how Allied airmen crippled the Luftwaffe and the German army in France. I began the theme of 6 air missions in the first book, continue on for the third, and how it was applied to a particular situation. For Operation Overlord, there were 6 simultaneous air missions executed. And we need to remember that if you were an airman during the Overlord operation, you were not generally aware of everything that was going on. You had your little stovepipe that you were focused on. The more stars you had on your shoulders, the bigger the picture you had, but less detail. So the first mission, strategic attack on the German homeland, and then defense from Luftwaffe attack and recon, defense of the maritime routes, defeat of Kriegsmarine coastal forces, troop and cargo transport, and of course, ultimately support of the land forces. All these were executed pretty much simultaneously. First of all, strategic air attack of German homeland was actually begun by the RAF late in 1939 with some tentative daylight raids, which did not go well for them. They fairly quickly switched to night bombing, and because of the nature of technology at the time, it became night area bombing. The technique that they used was not so much as to destroy specific targets as to destroy cities. The cities where Germans workers lived, especially the cities in the Ruhr, and also, of course, Berlin and some of the other key cities in Germany. The objective was still to destroy Germany's war industry, but to do it, they had to pretty much look at displacing or killing the workforce. As far as the U.S. Air Force was concerned, the U.S. Army Air Force at the time was based in Britain and later in Italy. It began its campaign against the German homeland sometime early in 1943 with attacks against coastal Germany targets. Emphasis back it was a long-standing policy of the U.S. Air Force or U.S. Army Air Force to do precision daylight bombing. To that end, they had purchased heavy bombers able to penetrate deep into enemy territory to attack key industrial targets. Precision meaning that they were able to deliver their bomb loads within a very small area. And they were also accurate daylight bombing in that they had a bomb site which was advertised at least to be able to hit very small targets from high altitude. In the event, that wasn't always the case, but it was always the attempt to hit specific targets, not area targets, with our bombing. Targets within Germany included airplanes and vehicle production, as well later the oil industry specifically. An additional objective at the beginning was U-boat production, but by the end of 1943, we pretty much had the U-boats under control in the Atlantic, and it was airplanes and vehicles, that is, military vehicles, that became a very important objective. And in the spring, we realized that oil was really the Achilles heel of the German war machine and really intensified our attacks in that. At the same time, we attacked the transportation infrastructure within Germany because it is also key to getting the supplies and equipment being manufactured out to the troops. And finally, at the same time also was going on, the attacks, both by the bombers and later escorted by effective fighters, were able to decimate the Jagdwaffe, that is the German fighter force. And because of that, the Jagdwaffe was unable to defend, first of all, the periphery of the German occupied Europe, and later actually the homeland itself. So as the strategic campaign developed, sometime prior to D-Day, in the spring of 1944, the Air Force said, hey, this is the critical, we have finally found the critical node to attack, the critical nexus where everything comes together. And that was the German oil industry, because the Germans had no major domestic oil sources. They had, again, I hope you can see my pointer down in Romania down here. They had fairly large oil resources. They had attempted to capture more in southern Russia, but that are actually Soviet Union. That didn't work out so well for them. They were pulling back. The Russians were attacking them very vigorously from the east, and were getting ready to overrun the Romanian oil sources. So all these hydrogenation plants, which turned brown coal essentially into liquid fuel, all these came under strategic bombing attack mainly by the U.S. Army Air Force based in England, and also after the invasion of Italy, we based additional strategic bombers down in Italy. So the the oil industry was hit from actually three sides: from the Soviet Union by land primarily, and then by the United States Air Force from Britain and Italy. And of course, the RAF also did some attacks against oil industry too. But again, that was more area bombing than specific oil production facilities. The second major mission that was happening at the time was defense from Luftwaffe attack and reconnaissance. That's because the Luftwaffe was still considered the primary adversary for the Allied Air Forces. And I do say Allied Air Forces because although we designate U.S. Army Air Force and RAF and the expatriate air forces of some of the occupied countries, in effect, we were really one integrated air force, cooperated, shared equipment where that was necessary, and learned many lessons from one another. Also, in this defense, we restricted Luftwaffe reconnaissance, so that the Germans really never knew where the invasion was going to originate in the United Kingdom. They were not allowed to overfly any critical areas in the United Kingdom. They were allowed to overfly areas in which deception operations were undertaken. The part of this effort was the establishment, actually beginning in the Battle of Britain, or actually before, of a ground radar detection and control system that was able to detect enemy aircraft and direct interceptors, friendly interceptors, to them to destroy them. And that we also, as time went on with communications intelligence, was able to exploit the German fighter control system. And that was actually part of our defense, but it was done by collecting their communications between their control system and their fighters. And finally, damaging and destroying German airfields. This began in 1942 and really intensified during 1943 and into 1944. So German radar sites, there were many along the coast, of course, of northern France, and this is our area of interest for this book. Most of these were destroyed by Allied fighter bombers, especially the RAF Typhoon fighter bomber, which was equipped with rockets. And radar sites are allergic to rockets, and rockets were very effective in destroying them. Not all of them were destroyed. We had to be selective. We didn't want to pinpoint exactly where the invasion would be executed. So we hit radar sites all up and down the coast. But the ones we accidentally, in quotes, left intact were the ones that we intended to exploit during the deception operations that were conducted in conjunction with the invasion. And you should see there's quite a few. That fighter control system, the Germans by 1944 had an exquisite fighter control system. The trouble was, just like other air forces, they loved to chatter on the radio with between aircrafts and between aircraft and the units on the ground. And because we knew we were able to intercept those communications from the United Kingdom, we were able to pinpoint exactly where headquarters were. These are Jafu, for example. You can see, I don't know if you can read that on your screen, but that's a Jagdführer. That's a ground controller who's controlling this particular set of aircraft out here over the North Sea. So there were various Jafus around, including one in Brittany, to try and intercept our anti-submarine aircraft out here in the Atlantic. And those operated in daytime and nighttime. There were a different set of control centers. all controlled by a fighter corps near Paris, and then all the way up to Berlin, where the Luftwaffe headquarters was. So we left this all intact. We didn't attack these guys. Why? Because they couldn't keep their mouths shut, and they gave us a lot of good intelligence that we exploited. This, incidentally, is a page photocopied from the original Overlord air plan. So this is a real no kidding document. I removed the top secret markings so that they didn't let me out of the National Archives till all it was marked out. But this was from the 15th of April. We had a very good idea about how they operated, and we exploited that. Airfield attacks. We didn't want any Luftwaffe over or near our landing area or the area occupied inland, which was called the lodgment. So we went about in the months prior to D-Day an intense campaign to incapacitate every Luftwaffe airfield within 130 miles of Caen. Caen is a little French city here. It was considered by the British to be the center of gravity for the invasion, even though it wasn't exactly in the center of the invasion geographically. The British considered it to be a very important road intersection, and they centered their landing against Caen. So Caen was everything within 130 miles that had an airfield was attacked repeatedly. And we attacked it both with leaflets, with espionage, with sabotage, but with the Air Force mainly with bombs and strafing. And thing to point out in this photograph, incidentally, all these maps and photographs are in the book. We didn't bomb runways too much. You know, you see the war movies, it's always bombing the runways. What we bombed were the maintenance facilities, which are down here at the edge of the airfield. Runways were occasionally hit, but by accident. But mainly, and again, you can see this precision bombing. This is their maintenance area. Well, you can land all the airplanes out here, but if you can't maintain them and refuel them, the runways are useless anyway. So that was the primary target. And again, if you know your Air Force history and all like that, and some tactics, this string of material here, this would be a element of bombers, which was, 3 bombers, and this would be a squadron attack. And here's most of a squadron, 2-3 aircraft elements up here, delivering more bombs. They're on the way down. The result is, if you can kill them on the ground, you don't have to kill them in the air. Now, told you before, we preserved some of the radar sites. On the day before and the day of D-Day, we ran a series of fake invasions aimed at the Boulogne area down here in the Pas-de-Calais, and another one aimed sort of in the Le Havre area, Dieppe, if you remember the Dieppe invasion from 42. It was in this area. The Germans always thought we would land up here, so we assisted their misapprehension by running fake invasions. These were ships towing radar reflectors, just a few ships. They looked like a fleet on enemy radar. And also we had squadrons of RAF bombers dropping chaff, jamming material down on top of the ships, which we would do in a real invasion. The idea being that it would again hide, so-called hide, but we didn't hide it very well. We actually wanted to see it. Also here we had ABC jammers. That was Airborne Cigar was the code name. And these guys knew the radar frequencies, and the communications frequencies for all these control centers. And so they just broadcast white noise on those frequencies, kept the Germans having to switch frequencies, which added to the general confusion they experienced in D-Day. We were so good at all of this that we pretty much kept the Luftwaffe away, but we didn't know how effective it was going to be until the event. So therefore, over the immediate invasion area at low altitude, we mainly used the P-38 as our defensive air-to-air fighter, because we wanted to make sure that the Navy guys down below were very good with their anti-aircraft guns, knew those were Allied fighters over them. And the P-38, this is actually a scan from a World War II recognition poster, was so distinctive from any other German aircraft that would possibly attack the fleet that it was hopeful that that all the Navy gunners would recognize and avoid shooting them. A few of them collected some rounds, unfortunately, but not many. And generally, it was a good procedure, and it worked for us. You may be wondering about the jets at this point. Oh, those miraculous German jets that were going to throw the invasions back. Well, Hitler certainly thought so. There were 2 German jets in operation by D-Day, neither one of which were effective against the invasion or even impeded it. The first one was the AR-234, a reconnaissance bomber, very fast, but had to operate at very high altitude, was not particularly long range. And when you knock out all their airfields within 130 miles, this guy can get very close to the invasion beaches. They had another problem in that the Jumo engines that powered this aircraft were made using metals that were not particularly heat tolerant. Therefore, they could only operate 15 to 20 hours before the engines had to be changed, which cut their operational rate down quite a bit. And actually, they didn't get any good reconnaissance sorties out of these aircraft until almost August. And by the time they got around to getting over the beaches, we had landed maybe 1.5 million men. So all the pictures they took pretty much added to the general depression that was occurring in German headquarters by that time. Another plane that was supposed to be a miraculous savior of the Third Reich was the Me-262, designed as a jet fighter, of course. Also had those faulty Jumo engines, which gave them a lot of problems. They lost a lot of jet pilots with these engines because they had a bad habit of flaming out on takeoff, which will ruin your whole day. And the problem was when Hitler saw this first demonstrated in November 1943, that's 8 months or so before D-Day, he said, finally you've built me a jet bomber, a fast bomber, a blitz bomber. I'll be able to throw the invasion back by bombing it. And unfortunately, Willie Messerschmitt Company were going, whoa, well, not to himself. Well, said it to himself. He didn't tell Hitler, well, we never designed this to be a bomber. So instead of producing these great numbers of these, they had to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to put bombs on them. And eventually they got them into combat. That'll be covered in much detail in the 4th book. The third thing we had to do was defend the maritime routes. First of all, the routes from the North America that were coming into the British Isles. Of course, just D-Day did not stop our massive reinforcement of the military in Britain. And so those maritime routes into Britain and also from Britain into France had to be defended. How do we do that? 3 ways. We excluded the U-boats from the English Channel. Very few got through, even less survived the experience. We also restricted Luftwaffe maritime attack, because Luftwaffe did have maritime attack aircraft and missiles. And finally, the Kriegsmarine surface attack. The Kriegsmarine had a very robust surface attack force in the Channel. Talk about in a second. Back to the U-boats. We put an air and sea plug on the western part of the English Channel. The big U-boat bases were down here from Brest south all the way to Bordeaux. That's how they got out into the Atlantic. By the D-Day, this already was a very, very dangerous area for U-boats to operate in. And we made it essentially impossible for them to come out of any of these bases and go into the channel and attack the invasion fleet. If you're wondering about the east side there, this had already been blocked for years by anti-submarine minefields, actually laid by both sides. So it was very, very tough going to try to get in the channel if you were a U-boat driver. The Germans had a arsenal of anti-ship missiles, but in order to use them, they had to get close to the beach. And of course, that was the Air Force's job to keep them away. And by Air Force, I just mean the American Air Force. The Brits flew most of the night fighters that protected the fleet at night, which is when these guys had tended to attack. Now, this is one of their anti-ship missiles. It is a contraption consisting of a converted Ju-88 bomber, which has taken the crew compartment, removed, and a shape charge warhead. I think it's 2,000 kilogram warhead that could poke a fairly large size hole in the hull of a battleship. So it was a very dangerous weapon. The whole thing was flown or piloted by the guy in the single seater. And when he approached his target, he aimed it as well as he could with his gun sight, and then he cut it loose. And this thing kind of wandered into the general area where the target was. Wasn't very accurate. And of course, not many of them actually made it anywhere close to the invasion fleet. The only one I've read that definitely hit was one that hit one of the breakwater ships that the Allies intentionally sunk off the beaches to kind of cut the wave action down for the landing craft. So these were ineffective, as were all the other German anti-ship missiles and their aircraft. There were a few vessels sunk by the Luftwaffe, but not many, and certainly not enough to seriously impede or even marginally impede the invasion. Coastal forces, what were they? They're talking about the Navy now, the Kriegsmarine. E-boats, which looked kind of like American PT boats, but were bigger and better armed. T-boats, which kind of look like small destroyers. They're also main armament, again, is torpedoes. Mini submarines, essentially human torpedoes, but not suicide. They had a mechanism they could deliver the torpedo, and the rest of the little contraption was able to get back theoretically to the beach. And finally, of course, the Germans were continuously by sea laying mines and countermines, and by having air superiority over the channel, were able to deter some of that activity. The German Navy was very robust. You hardly ever hear about this in most D-Day histories, but the Germans had Navy bases all the way from Holland, actually in Germany, starting in the North Sea coast of Germany, all the way down the coast, all the way past Normandy and down the Atlantic coast. Of course, the U-boats were based up here, and also in the Mediterranean coast. The thickest concentration being in the Pas-de-Calais, the reason being that they thought the invasion was going to come across the Straits of Dover. And this was quite a threat to the invasion fleet, obviously, because this was the primary weapon. The most common attack vessel in the German Navy by this time were E-boats, and these carry 2 torpedoes each. So when you figure a U-boat had 4 torpedo tubes forward, that's what they attacked our merchant shipping with primarily. 2 of these equaled 1 U-boat. They were fast, they operated at night, and they were constructed so as to give minimum radar reflection. So they were very tough for air to counteract. We know they were dangerous because in April, 2 months prior to D-Day, we had the 4th Infantry Division, among the other divisions, conducted a rehearsal for the Utah beach landings. Originating in Plymouth, they sailed into Lime Bay, and they were going to land here at Slapton Sands, which was an area that looked a lot like Utah Beach. And on the way there, they were intercepted by E-boats, excuse me, coming from Cherbourg. And these guys were out every night looking for Allied ships. And they intercepted the convoy coming out of Plymouth, mainly LSTs, landing ship tanks, and that had some of the 4th Infantry Division aboard for the practice landing. And the 4th Infantry Division actually lost more troops in that E-boat attack than they did on Utah Beach 2 months later. So a very serious threat. And so it was addressed, not only by the RAF night patrols and Royal Navy night patrols, but also because in daytime, the American Air Force attacked all the E-boat bases all along the coast. Again, not trying to give the Germans a cue as to where we're going to land. This is the one of the E-boat bases in Holland, you can see the base itself has been blanketed by bombs. Again, trusty B-26, one of my favorite airplanes. And you can see they hit the base. They didn't hit the town. This was not area bombing. This is precision bombing. This is what it looks like. They didn't hit the base. They didn't hit the civilian terminals, anything like that. Strictly the German military facility. And shut this down for a period. So now we get into land forces, the air support land forces. The primary function of attacking enemy land forces is to isolate them, suppress them, that is, make them duck, and then destroy them where necessary. On the ground situation in Normandy or in France on June 1st, there were two army groups. The one defending the North Sea, English Channel coast, in northern France was Army Group B. It was commanded by Erwin Rommel. You may have heard of him at some point in your history readings. And he had both static and mobile divisions here along the coast. And Hitler had forced most of the mobile divisions to be based further back towards Paris and not right along the coast. So they were vulnerable to anything that might affect their movements on the roads. For our ground troops, though, we did not land nearly as many divisions during Overlord as the Germans had in France. Most people don't understand that we actually were the small army after the main invasion. We were the smaller of the two armies. The Germans had more troops, more tanks, for a while at least, and for a long period after the landings. But they didn't have the mobility we had, and that was the key to winning. This is the Normandy transport network. The primary means of moving stuff in the German army was not by road. The German army was not well motorized. Most of their artillery was horse-drawn, not self-propelled. Their infantry, in the main, moved on foot. They did have trucks. They weren't totally devoid of trucks. But the trucks were not well maintained. Many of them had been captured in 1940, were showing their age. And having truck transport was a problem for the Germans. So with those dependencies and those problems, we looked at the transportation system and we targeted critical points. 2 points were targeted. The rail yards were targeted for a while. That caused a lot of civilian casualties. Was never popular with the Air Force, either Air Force, RAF or the American Air Force. But what we finally fixated on and what worked really well was the bridges and tunnels. Because if you've been to northern France here, you know there are a lot of bridges and a lot of tunnels. The topography is mixed. Along the coast, it's mainly bridges because there's a lot of waterways there. And as you get south in this area, you get the hills of Normandy and you start to get some tunneling going on. And down here at Samar, if you needed to get something up from the southern part of France, is a huge road and rail tunnel under the Loire River. This is the Loire River here. So anyway, all these bridges became targets. Again, the dependence of the Germans. They could not run tanks hundreds of miles across along roads, even if there was no Allied air superiority. The tanks mechanically were not that reliable. And also, of course, starting much early in the war, we started to hit the oil industry. Didn't have a lot of fuel. And of course, they had to get the fuel to where the tanks were. So it was a problem for them. And we intended to exacerbate that problem. We established 3 lines of interdiction. Interdiction is blocking supply routes, essentially. And so the target bridges, incidentally, this little circle is a symbol for that. The first interdiction line was the Seine River. And then we expanded that away from the Seine along what's called the Paris-Orleans Gap, or Orleans Gap, if you're French, and along some minor rivers that also had to be bridged all the way down to the Loire. The Loire River from the Atlantic coast up and all the way around here to Clemency and then up all the way up through here was the second interdiction line. And think about this. Think about bridges and the fact that all these bridges were attacked. A lot of air effort. In the 2 months before D-Day, we lost 12,000 airmen in bridge attacks. So it was not a cheap campaign, but it was an effective campaign because before D-Day, 7th Army, which was the intended victims, the initial victims of the invasion, was already running short of supplies and fuel. And to add insult to injury, they decided to do a third interdiction line, which ran along the River Meuse. You might recognize that from World War I. They also dropped a lot of, if not most of these bridges, and they runs up through past Bastogne there, Liège, all the way up into Belgium, up into Holland. By this time, it's called the Maas. It's the same river, just name change. And so you could actually, Germans could still get stuff across the Rhine, but they couldn't get it across the Maas very easily. And that also included air attacks against coastal vessels, German coastal vessels out here in the estuary. How do we knock the bridges down? Well, the popular thing, the thing you see most pictures of is these nice bomb bursts, right? This is precision bombing here again, hitting the roadway in the middle. And that was cool. That, you know, made the pilot feel good. The more effective way to do it, and the way a lot of guys have come before, is to actually hit the bridge approaches and the bridge structure here, right on the bank, because it will definitely drop this part of the bridge, which is in a lot of ways the hardest part to replace. And so you can see this has already been bombed before, and this time Lucky Bomb took out the center span, but most of the effective bombing was done on the edges. The bombing began with medium bombers. This is a British B-25, American type that British got a whole bunch of. And we didn't use a B-25 in Northern Europe. Our B-25s, American B-25s, were all down in the Mediterranean because they had a better range than the B-26 and were more appropriate for the Mediterranean theater than the Northern Europe. But the most effective bridge dropper turned out to be the P-47 Thunderbolt. It had been relieved of much of its escort responsibilities by the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. And so these guys became essentially dive bombers, kind of like high-speed self-defending Stukas. And they were very good at knocking it down bridges. And I don't have statistics to give you, but I will tell you that many, if not most of the bridges that were knocked down in that interdiction campaign was done by P-47s. That tunnel I talked about before down in Samar, down in the Loire River, that was knocked out by a Lancaster from the Dam Buster Squadron, the 617. It was under a mountain or under a large hill, and so the British, being always can cut to the chase, they dropped a few 12,000-pound tall boy bombs on it, collapsed the whole hill down into the tunnel. Okay, next mission that was being done concurrently, and this actually, of course, started long before D-Day because you had all those paratroopers to train, which meant they had to do a lot of jumps. So these guys were busy long before the D-Day attack itself. These guys did airborne attack. That was their primary mission. But later, as its campaign proceeded, in fact, almost immediately at the evening of D-Day, they began landing in France and evacuating the most critically wounded GIs and British troops back to England. So troop carrier, you always hear about them with paratroopers, but in actuality, they also carried cargo, and they also were essential not only for the initial attack, but to support it until the airborne troops link up with the ground troops. So these airborne attacks were used to secure both flanks of the invasion, so the Germans could not attack the invasion from either flank. They were forced to approach it, the beach, perpendicularly rather than along the beach. They had to drive around the obstacles provided by the airborne units. And meanwhile, the airborne units opened the exits from the beaches on both sides. And also because they were dropped at night, this was the last big night airdrop because it confused everybody. Fortunately, it confused the Germans more than the Allies, and they didn't know what was happening because some guys landed far off the drop zones because of the weather and the heavy winds that were not anticipated, and the difficulties of night navigation. And but when you have guys dropping all over, obviously there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason. It really made it actually more effective than it might have been otherwise. And of course, having all these guys now landing at your headquarters and maybe in town where you expect to go have a drink after work, suddenly you're not ready to counterattack anybody. You're just wondering if your bunk is still safe. So that lest we not forget that that these were regular guys. These guys, transport pilots. This is Bud Berry. I interviewed him in 2003 at the troop carrier reunion. A lot of his oral interview is in Thunder Over Normandy. These guys flew the C-47. This was an airplane designed to be an airliner. Actually, the only thing they did to make it a warplane was paint it green and gray and reinforce the floor so that it would hold up something heavier than a tourist. And pretty much that's the way they went into war. No self-sealing fuel tanks for D-Day. So if it got hit in a fuel tank, it was very susceptible to catching on fire, which some of them did. Anyway, so these guys, bravest of the braves, because unlike most of the other airmen, they couldn't shoot back. These are some of the same guys. This is Bud again in 2003, and some of his mates from that landed at D-Day. Oh, by the way, these guys didn't get the rest of the war off. They were hauling cargo the day after. They were the guys who flew, or some of the guys that flew airborne for Market Garden in Arnhem, and also the rest of the Market Garden operation that happened in September, and also to fly the new 17th Airborne Division and the British Airborne Division into Germany in early 1945. So guys didn't get the rest of the war off simply because they were flying very vulnerable and very valuable airplanes. And what they delivered was the ultimate precision-guided munition of World War II, the paratrooper. And this is unlike some of the precision-guided munitions we have today. This guy would knock on your front door and then kill you. So where he was dropped, they were very effective and self-sustaining, and probably the single most effective weapon delivered by the Air Forces. Now, the good old trusty Goonie Bird could actually carry 21 of these guys, but it was kind of close inside. These guys are all flying coaches, you can see. That's the crew compartment back there, or in front there, and we're looking up the central walkway. And there's actually in this aircraft, you can't see some of them, but there's 18 guys. And I can tell you right now that they're probably happy that they're finally getting what they've been preparing for a year, finally getting it underway. Not happy to get shot at, but happy to finally be getting to do something. So there they are. And I know that some of these guys did not survive the war even that day. Additional guys, those are paratroopers. We also had in each of our airborne divisions, and Brits had lots of these too, glider infantry. These guys that were trained to land in gliders and then open them up and pull equipment and themselves out and go to war. This is a glider landing field in Normandy. You can see parachutes from parachute deliveries and also some of the gliders that have already landed here in the background. If you can't see these pictures very well on your computer, they're all in the book. The C-47 also had bomb shackles. Some of them did anyway, and they could hang these guys in the bottom of them. These are paracrates. So they could either push out door bundles with the sticks as they drop the paratroopers, or they could drop one of these at the end of at the end, or door bundles out the fuselage, and give them some additional weapons they couldn't carry in their persons. This is the stick. Each troop carrier group generate 2 sticks of aircraft. Each stick of aircraft carried a battalion of airborne troops. So, or half a battalion, excuse me. This is a particular stick. Bud Berry gave me this. Of they carried Easy Company of the 101st Airborne Division. That's the one that Steve Ambrose did a television series about. And if you're familiar with the series, this particular aircraft carried Lieutenant Winters, who was a star of the show, if you will. This aircraft had Sergeant Lipton, the top NCO in Easy Company. This particular aircraft was lost with its stick of paratroopers. This one was carrying Lieutenant Meehan, who was the original Easy Company commander. He was actually killed with his paratroopers that were with him. 18 men, plus 4 men in Capilouto's crew were shot down. This aircraft was also shot down. Lots of flak that night. They were dropped, but the stick was actually out the airplane before it was shot down. So they lost some of the crew there, but not the stick paratrooper. Routes they flew in, and again, these little circles here were to deceive the radar jammer type stuff, plus the little hexagons here, pentagons or navigation points, lights. One route to collect all these serials of aircraft, okay, hundreds of them, and they were routed through this one point right here. Imagine doing this at night in not so great weather, when you have hundreds of airplanes converging on a point, all carefully timed to arrive at exactly the right time, and then to depart through this channel where they're protected by radar jammers and things and night fighters, all the way down here, and wend their way into Normandy, or coated peninsula of Normandy, past heavy German anti-aircraft in the Channel Islands out here. It had to be all timed and navigated exactly correctly, which it was. Unfortunately, when they got down in here, there were heavy clouds, not anticipated, not forecast. It did split some of the formations up, and all the details are in the book if you're interested in that. This was the landing area in here. There were 3 designated drop zones. Well, actually, there were 2, here and here. The idea was to occupy this area down here along the Douve, and also to open up, this is Utah Beach, open up this beach, occupy the causeways coming through swamps, so that the amphibious troops could penetrate into the inland here. This all succeeded. Some of these guys were scattered. Some of the units were intermixed, but enough guys were landed at the right places so that all the missions were accomplished on time. And that made the landing itself a success. It cut off any German counterattack from the southwest here. And it also isolated Cherbourg, which was a big port, which we needed to capture. And so an incredibly successful landing. And unfortunately, doesn't get the credit it's due. And the guys who delivered these guys, the airborne guys, have sometimes been maligned because they are said not have done a good job. Actually, they were among the best trained airmen in the U.S. Air Force, or in the RAF for that matter. So here's the other beaches while we're on this. Utah, Omaha was the amphibious attack. Gold, Juno, and Sword were that was the American amphibious attack. The Brits landed and Canadians landed in these beaches, and then the British airborne attack was over here on the other flank to cut off any attack from the southeast. Now, what they found when they landed, all through the Cotentin and down through Normandy, which would hold up moving inland quite a bit, was bocage. Bocage are the ancient farmers' fields from the Middle Ages. Some of these walls of trees and shrubs are 10 feet high. If your wife's a gardener, you can talk to her about how hard it is to even get through a wall of plants like that. And of course, the Germans used them to their advantage, and it really slowed down the advance. Anyway, the British Airborne, of course, landed from this side of the UK, and they were dropped to the east of Caen, as I said. Their first assault was with gliders rather than paratroopers. The paratroopers was used as follow-on troops. It's a different tactic than we used, but it worked. This was a map, and again, also in the book, if you're interested, of all the landing zones and the location of the German armor, which essentially was kept from approaching the beach till late in the morning. These guys were able, because there was no blocker there, these guys were kept from reaching the beaches because of the British airborne landings. I actually talked to the commander of this regiment in 1984 at a D-Day reenactment in New Orleans, and there was a convention there, and he was a very interesting character. Did not like the American Air Force very much. He expressed to me. This is a German aerial reconnaissance photograph, and shows the British landing area. They took these two bridges, the one over the Caen Canal and the one over near Ranville. And you see this if you've seen the movie The Longest Day, the airborne attack against this bridge, which was renamed Pegasus Bridge in honor of the British airborne guys who have Pegasus as their mascot. Okay, so German tanks based down here, down the bottom here, if you can see my cursor, could not move up either on this side to go across the Ranville Bridge, or the shortcut going up the middle here to go over this bridge, the Pegasus Bridge. They were cut off, and they had to go all the way around, way south of Caen, and come back north. And they were late to the eventual German armored counterattack, which incidentally, by the time the Germans made it, since we're in this picture, the German counterattack eventually came against Sword Beach, only got about this far, never made it to the sand, because by that time they were swamped with British and American fighter bombers. Another map, a little close-up map of the British airborne landing, and the guy who flew the lead glider, Wally Walwork, is in the book called Pegasus Bridge, if you're interested in that one. And he actually promised his commander that he would put the commander's glider in the barbed wire that was protecting this bridge, the German barbed wire. And that's exactly what he did. Again, if you see the movie The Longest Day, you'll see that dramatized. Okay, now the main event, of course, was the amphibious landing from ports all along the south coast of England. You can see the different U.S. divisions here and the British divisions. Incidentally, if you're wondering why the U.S. got this side of the attack and the Brits got this side, it was because the Brits were already in Britain before the war started, and their army bases were concentrated here. All the arriving U.S. units came into Bristol pretty much, and so their bases were built in the western part of England. So for the rest of the war, the Americans were always on the west and south side, and the Brits and Canadians were always on the east and north side of the invasion of France. So amphibious air support. They wanted us to bomb the beaches with light bombs to dig foxholes for the troops. They wanted us to destroy the German fixed defenses, and during the assault itself, to lay smoke screens using A-20 light bombers with smoke generators. Also, the Navy, the U.S. Navy, told us that they had looked at the problem of gunfire adjustment. The big guns on the cruisers and battleships needed to have airplane over the target area to direct their gunfire. The float planes that those ships normally carry could not stand up against the Luftwaffe, and there was known at the time that the planning was going on that the Luftwaffe wasn't going to show up. So what the Navy did was they parked their float planes off these big cruisers and battleships, and they borrowed some obsolete or obsolescent Spitfire 5s These Spitfires were about 2-year-old models, so they were already obsolete. And they were already painted with the invasion stripes, the identification stripes, that theoretically at least kept the ground Allied gunners from shooting at them. Anyway, this is a Navy pilot, okay? Normally he would have been based in a battleship or a cruiser, and this is a Navy maintenance guy, okay? So 2 months before the invasion, these guys were actually training on a new airplane and how to fly it and how to maintain it. Now, the planes were armed because they were fighters, and a fortunate few Germans actually strayed in front of one of these, and they downed 1 or 2 Messerschmitts with them. But that's not what they were there for. They were there for gunfire direction. And also a couple of them were lost to Messerschmitts later in the invasion, and also to ground fire, both Allied and German. Okay, their job was to get gunfire on targets. This is a picture looking at Omaha Beach down here, and some of the really cliffside coastline there further up towards Point de la Hawk, if you're familiar with that one. This was one of the exits that the invaders along here were expected to exit. And of course, the Germans figured it out a long time ago, and they had sited their defenses up in these cliffs. And they were shooting down on these beaches, kind of hard to see. This, incidentally, over here, this is the remains of the artificial harbor that was towed over to provide a place to dock ships. So this was an important exit, and the big guns on the cruisers and battleships were the main way to get at these guys, because vertical bombs don't do a real good job against these cliffside emplacements. But what they asked the Air Force to do was drop bombs on the beach itself, with very small bombs to dig foxholes for the GIs coming off the landing craft. The Air Force was also asked to bomb the emplacements that could be hit by vertical bombs. This is Point de Hawk. This eventually was assaulted by U.S. Army Rangers. They climbed the cliffs to get up here. As you can see, they had been really thoroughly bombed by the Army Air Force, and to the point where the Germans had already withdrawn the big guns that were in bunkers here. It's kind of hard to see the bunkers because they're kind of covered with sand. But the Germans had withdrawn the guns several miles away, so the Rangers came up and found out that they kind of wasted the assault. But later on, the paratroopers from the west actually moved in and destroyed those big guns anyway before they could impede the invasion. Just to give you an idea of the scope of all the airborne bombing and air attacks that were going on. Like I said, the beach bombings were generally not successful because they were carrying light bombs, 100-pound bombs. And the Army told them to bomb 30 seconds or 60 seconds for the landing craft hit the ground. And the Air Force decided privately that no, they're not going to bomb within 60 seconds of a boat and kill a bunch of GIs. So they put a little lag time there to drop the bombs. And of course, the individual bombardiers added a little bit more to that. So most of those light bombs fell behind the beach, not on it. But the sum total of all of this stuff is that by the time we landed, soon after, with the valor of the ground troops that landed, pushing the Germans away from the beaches, we were able to use these beaches to unload all the supplies and equipment pretty much that were landed in France by sea all the way to August, because the big ports that we had hoped to capture weren't captured right away. And when Eisenhower's son visited this beach after the crowd showed up, this was, I guess, after the West Point graduation. Eisenhower's son was a West Point graduate that year. His son, of course, had recently read all the books about how to do a landing, said, well, look how crowded you are here. How could you possibly be doing this? Aren't you breaking all the rules? And Eisenhower said, he says, it's air superiority. If we didn't have air superiority, we wouldn't be here. So that was the value of air superiority and the air operations to this Neptune and to overall Overlord. Now, once you got ashore, you still got to fight the German army, what's left of it. And this is where the RAF and the fighter bombers, RAF and American fighter bombers came in. Many of them were equipped with 5-inch anti-tank rockets. And the Germans very quickly learned that they were not allowed to operate on the roads in Normandy, during the daylight at least. Even at night, there were some RAF planes out flying and would occasionally hit them on the roads. Landing right behind the initial infantry were engineers. They opened up the first forward airfield, emergency landing fields along the beach. This is a picture of how it looked right at the beginning. Built in among this area had just been cleared of Germans. Bulldozers were landed, and they built the first landings, and they were able within a day or two to land aircraft on the landing strips, and also C-47s bringing in more stuff and flying out the most critically wounded. And they went straight back to the hospital in England. Also landed fairly quickly were Army Aviation Engineer battalions, which were able to build airfields wherever there was flat space. And where there wasn't flat space, they made flat space. And as they moved inland, they were also able to occupy those German landing grounds that had been knocked out by the bombing. Again, we didn't hit the runways too much, so the runways were usable right away. And the U.S. Army Air Force had everything mounted on trucks, because unlike the Germans, we had lots of trucks. There you see this is an ex-German airfield, ex-German fighter, American P-51 Mustang. The airfields not only provided forward air support, but also allowed a place for damaged Allied aircraft to land rather than being abandoned and the pilots having to bail out. You see this P-47 has taken some flak damage on the trailing edge of the wing there, and looks like they sprayed him with foam in case his drop tank caught on fire. And this airplane will be repaired and will re-enter the fight at some point. By the beginning of August, they had that many these are all different phases of airfield construction. This many new airfields have been built, just in Normandy. So what was happening inland? Allied medium bombers and roving Jabbo patrols. Jabbo, incidentally, is a German term, short for fighter bomber. And Allied fighter bombers and medium bombers would just roam all day long along the roads looking for targets. Germans very quickly learned they didn't move during the daytime. Behind that line of attack were more attacks all the way to the approaches to Paris and around Paris, so that 7th Army's and the Army Group B's reinforcements from here had a very tough time trying to get to the beach. Most of them didn't make it, and many of them are still buried there. And the guys over here were still able to communicate to some degree, but they couldn't get across this river down here, the Loire. That was another line of interdiction. So 7th Army was in the bag. This is a picture. This is a gun camera film of a German armor and truck convoy trying to get to the beach. As you can see, it was a pretty rough ride there that day. And the result is this. This is actually a picture taken later in the war. But basically, the German armor that was operational, they still had fuel. Many, if not most of them, were destroyed by air, and of course by the army that carried their own anti-tank weapons. So German armor, which was the main striking weapon of the German ground forces, was pretty much canceled out by Allied air power. This is how many air attacks they were just against bridges and rail within the first 2 weeks of D-Day, and enemy airfields that were still occupied. Another thing we brought along with us were light artillery spotter aircraft for the Army artillery. As you can see, they're enthusiastic about finding Germans. So here's a guy flying along a road looking for Germans. And was that dangerous? Yes, very much. Did these guys take casualties? Yes, they did. Were they effective? Incredibly so. How important was air power to the ground commanders? Well, this is General Patton. You might have heard of him. General Patton had a habit. Every morning, him and his air commander driving around a battlefield, would go to the closest airfield, Allied airfield, and then we get briefed on the situation, because the most of the intelligence that was being collected behind the lines was being collected by airplanes, by photo reconnaissance planes. This is General Whalen. This is the air commander for Patton. And Patton would just go in and listen to the squadron brief, and would know right there exactly what was going on. He didn't even bother with the southern flank when he drove across France, because he said this guy was holding the southern flank. So he was able to just drive right across eventually into Germany. This picture, incidentally, looks like it was taken later in the war. This was before the Battle of the Bulge. You can pretty much tell if you know where the lines are at different phases. But they're coming up against the Rhine Valley here, and probably, like I said, before the Battle of the Bulge. And you can see the Allied armies closing up on the Rhine here. The General Whalen's P-47s and the other Casadas P-47s with the First U.S. Army, and the British Typhoons with the British and Canadian armies flying column cover. These are American tanks advancing in this village. This guy is a P-47. He's checked this village out. And so if the Germans, after a while, knew if they stuck their head out to try to shoot at these tanks, that it wasn't going to go well for them. Contrast this with 1940, when these would have been French tanks trying to fight the Germans. This would have been a Messerschmitt. So that's the contrast. Interesting to note that many, if not most, of the derelict German tanks we found in Normandy, we found a lot of them, were simply out of gas. They were still operational. No gas. No gas. You're kind of a threat there in the local area, but beyond the range of your gun, you're pretty much done. So, in February, 21st Army Group, which General Montgomery's command, he commanded the ground forces in the initial landing. This was his plan, as he laid out in February, that we would land in Normandy, that they would land the U.S. First Army and the UK Second Army. Again, the U.S. First Army in the west because of where we were in England, and the Second Army in the east because of where they were in England. And the Second Army would drive through Caen, joined by the Canadians on their flank, and the U.S. First Army would drive south. And then Patton's Third Army would be landed behind them, which happened eventually. And the First Army would swing around to cover the British southern flank through Chartres and towards Paris. The Third Army would split here. A third of it would go in to capture the Brittany Peninsula, which was not heavily garrisoned with mobile troops. And the rest of the Third Army would cover First Army's flank to the south. Of course, General Patton read this plan, but didn't follow it very well. But anyway, this was the intention, that by the end of August, the 21st Army Group would be along and would occupy the west bank of the Seine. Paris would still be mostly under German control, and that's where we would ride out the winter, allowing the supplies and all to be landed through liberated Cherbourg and maybe some of the other smaller ports. And we would regroup, and then we would attack in the spring or the following spring. But what really happened was, even though we were bogged down by the bocage here, and the Brits did their wheel to the east as they scheduled themselves, the First Army followed them to the south covering air flank. When we landed the First Army, we had a breakthrough at St. Lo, or near St. Lo, and the Third Army pushed through, and General Patton sent his third of the army through, but the other 2/3, which were sent to the east, didn't stop on the stop line like they were supposed to. They kept going. And the British, of course, not to be outdone, also crossed the Seine. The U.S. First Army also, and the French division in it, liberated Paris. And by the end of August, and that August 31st, when we're supposed to be in the Seine, we were actually on the Belgian-French border and over the Meuse River, and we were actually almost to the Rhine by just not many months after that. So actually, even though we were very slow getting out of the lodgement here, we crossed France and liberated France very quickly. Fortunately, from the south, out of the scope of this book, the U.S. also landed an army which wrapped up the Germans in the south of the Loire River here. So that's how the 6 air missions were executed. That's what I cover in the book. And I'm going to turn it back over to Greg, and we can continue on.
Oh, wonderful, Joe. Thank you. We've already got a number of questions in the queue. I'll take 1 or 2 in the queue, and then I think we got, yeah, I know, Mike. I will close out with you. So first question, I've always wondered why the preliminary bombardment of the beach fortifications by the Air Force was not performed parallel to the water rather than perpendicular. This would have avoided the concern of hitting friendly troops, and most of the overshooting would still have been useful. This, of course, also—
Good question.
Yeah, operation.
The reason was the Army commanders wanted it to be executed perpendicular, just like they dictated. And remember, the Army Air Force was part of the Army. So when the Army 4-star says, or the British Field Marshal says, I want it executed perpendicular, we execute perpendicular. We explained, General Doolittle explained to Montgomery and Bradley that precision bombing in that and weather that was anticipated meant that the bombs would hit somewhere within a half mile of the aim point. We didn't want to bomb the beaches at all because we didn't want to kill GIs. Also because we knew any bombs we dropped on the beach would be relatively ineffective at digging holes in sand. If you've ever dug a hole in sand, you know that hole doesn't stay very long. And also, the emplacements that we might have bombed there were vertically placed into the cliff sides that were not really suitable for air bombardment, with the exception of Pointe du Hoc, because they had bunkers built on the surface rather than inset into the cliffs. So the reason was the Army asked for it, and like I said, it was the least successful part of it. I think one of the things very unsung was the Navy landing their spotter aircraft crews and maintenance guys and taking over these British Spitfires, because the naval bombardment was relatively effective. But the Germans had had years to prepare those defenses, and the defenses could not be kinetically defeated without the ground assault, which is an unfortunate fact of life.
One more from the queue here. Have you seen any reference to the delay in responding to a request for aid in vacuuming one of the large O flags in the Worthgau? It was the British who delayed and then refused. Was it curious that the U.S. Armed Forces held in the camp, yet the British decided?
Okay, could you start that question again?
Yeah, have you seen any reference to the delay in responding to a request for aid in evacuating one of the larger O flags in the Worthgau? It was the British who delayed and then refused. Was it curious that it was U.S. Armed Forces held in the camp, yet the British decided?
Okay, are you talking about a POW liberation?
Yeah, that I suspect that's what he is. Yeah.
Okay, that's outside the scope of the book. We didn't talk about that in this book. To do any air operations where POWs, just a general knowledge answer from me, okay? POW liberations and operations near POW camps were coordinated at a very high level because obviously we didn't want to kill our own guys. And as to who delayed it, when you're working with a staff and you got to coordinate through several headquarters, the very fact that you're coordinating delays decisions. And as far as if they were approaching ground troops, Allied ground troops, you also had to worry about when you sent airplanes in there, unless you was probably coordinated, you not attack your own troops thinking they're enemy troops around the POW camp. So it's a difficult thing to task, but I really don't cover that in the book. It will be in the 4th book. Because you know, in the 4th book, we were overrunning or tried to overrun several POW camps. And incidentally, General Patton also tried to do it. Didn't turn out too well for him. That's kind of outside the scope of this book.
Totally appreciate that, Joe. Mike, if you want to ask your question, we can close out with you.
Yes, actually, it's a couple of questions. A couple of points, though. The reason that the German army was mainly horse-drawn was because of the Allied strategic bombing, particularly the U.S. precision bombing campaign. They just, not just with fuel, but with ball bearings, replacement parts, and that had started in 1943, and actually started in 1942. But my questions are, one was about the elephant in the room, which is
Mike, can I make a comment?
Sure.
Can I make a comment at this point?
Yeah.
The problem with the shortage of the problem with the shortage of trucks goes back to the mid 1930s, after Hitler took over the economy, and Hitler was very oriented towards we give everything to the military, and all civilian industry takes second fiddle. He also counted on captured vehicles. He did capture a lot of them during 1940, but he never built the civilian. He never built the civilian industrial infrastructure that we did, and the Brits did to a little bit lesser extent, that helped us win the war. He didn't have a Henry Ford to build trucks. He didn't have a Studebaker to build trucks. He didn't have a GMC to build deuce and a halves. He didn't have a Willis to build Jeeps. So he counted on the civilian industry, but did not give it the appropriate resources, because he was too oriented to building weapons and not logistics. And so he as a national leader, he was a failure in so many aspects, not only in his judgment, but in building or preparing his country for a war, which incidentally pretty much he started. But anyway, that's my opinion, but that's based on my research on this. By 1939, he was already short on trucks. And that's why when Rommel and the other armored divisions got to the coast, and they wanted to keep on going and capture Dunkirk, the infantry divisions were still in the German border trying to catch up on foot. So, the German army started off, pardon the pun, on the wrong foot, and they never caught up. And there's a good book called Soldat, which is, I can't remember who wrote it, German for Soldier. And he talks about getting in the German army and ended up in a horse-drawn artillery battalion. And most of their effort in that battalion was taking care of the horses. So yeah, kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
No,
but
no, I was just, I agree with you on all that. It's just that the bombing, when they did try to catch up, the bombing campaign certainly didn't help things.
You betcha. You betcha.
Yeah, and also with replacement parts. But the question has to do, well, two questions. One with the weather, which again is the elephant in the room. On D-Day itself, the weather was good enough, but just good enough.
Right.
And in the days following the on D+1, D+2, D+3, before the airfields could be set up, that you had to deal with the weather. The weather might be clear in Normandy, but not clear over England, and how the weather impacted the air support and the air interdiction over the Normandy area itself. Also, when they built those airfields,
what's the question there, Mike?
Oh, to what degree the weather affected Allied air support, tactical air support over the Normandy beachhead, particularly not just on D-Day, but on the few days right after D-Day, before the beaches were linked up. And the second question, if I can slip it in, when they built those airfields, did they have to, in other words, did they make sure that the airfields, did they try to build them outside of German artillery range, which would have made them far less effective, actually? To what extent did they take that into consideration? The idea of German artillery, German 88s, which until they had pushed much further inland to take out those German artillery placements. So that's really two separate questions, but.
Right. Let me do the weather first.
Yeah.
The weather was variable, as you know. I'm sure everybody listening knows the RAF Meteorological Service guaranteed Eisenhower one acceptable day, and that was June 6th. June 5th didn't pan out so good, and so they moved that acceptable day to June 6th, and they went. But there was bad weather, intermittent bad weather over the beachhead. But when your medium bombers and your fighter bombers couldn't do close air support, they were sent further inland to where it was clear. And there were always clear areas to bomb. The heavy bombers were always sent into Germany whenever the weather was bad over France. And honestly, the heavy bombers were not the weapon of choice by the U.S. Army Air Force, or the RAF for that matter, to do any kind of air support for the Army, because you're working close to troops. So the medium bombers and the fighter bombers were the weapons of choice. And those were sent to areas that were clear. There were always enough targets in the clear areas to keep them busy. And when the weather's bad for the attackers, it's also bad for the defenders. So it was a matter of adjusting your attacks, your target schedule to the weather. I was in Desert Storm. I was an A-10 intelligence officer in Desert Storm. We always had alternatives for weather. In that case, it was sandstorms, but same sort of thing. We designated secondary targets, because there were always more targets for airplanes than there are airplanes to service them. The second question had to do sighting airfields. They sighted airfields where there was an area suitable for an airfield. Yes, the Germans were often within range of the airfields. Yes, they did kill airmen on the airfields. Yes, they did knock out some Allied aircraft on the airfields. And when they did that, we resented it. And therefore, for each battery that did it, they normally didn't get to do it again. So yes, that was considered, but it was not a reason to not build an airfield. The weather also impacted the airfield construction, because obviously for the airfields built from scratch, you had to land the materials, bulldozers, troops, that sort of thing, to get that airfield built. And one critical item for building them, Normandy's a very dusty place if you've ever been there. In the summer when it's dry, it goes from dust to mud. They had to land pierced steel planking and matting to hold the dust down, because sometimes if you made your airfield just a dirt airfield, sometimes you couldn't fly simply because the guys flying out ahead of you had raised so much dust you couldn't see the runway. So yeah, the German artillery was considered, but the Germans were also smothered by Allied artillery. We had built and produced so much, the only limiting factor we had in artillery was our ability to get it to the tubes to fire it. We had more than enough artillery in place. One of the supply bottlenecks on occasion was getting more shells to the artillery batteries, but we had a lot of it. We had a lot of batteries, and again, we always had artillery superiority over the Germans. The 88 was much more of a factor against our tanks, and frankly, the 88 was a factor against any tank, because it was a very effective weapon.
Yeah.
And did you answer those, Mike?
Yes, you did. Thanks. And by the way, great talk.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Mike. Joe, there's one more question in the queue. How are you for time?
I can stay here until another hour or so. And I got to go to church.
I don't know if I would have been that specific, but Alex, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question, we can close out with you. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. I wanted to ask, one of the kind of unsung things in your book, you mentioned in your book, is the role of airplane spotters, particularly for directing artillery
Right.
in Normandy. So yes, I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. As I mentioned, well, first of all, there was, of course, the Navy guys who were landed. That happened, probably sometime in April or early May, because they weren't 100% sure. You're never sure in war exactly what's going to happen, except we can be pretty sure it won't happen exactly the way you planned it. So they did an analysis on Neptune, which was the naval part of it. And until we got enough Army artillery ashore, we had to use the Navy for indirect fire support. So those guys, those naval aviators, were well trained already in our spotting artillery. They got some additional training on spotting land impacts while they were in the UK. And of course, there was a lot of training that had to be done flying. They were flying float planes that go 120 miles an hour. Suddenly, they're in a 350 mile an hour Spitfire. So they got to know how slow they can fly it and still stay airborne. And and of course, visibility, since they had no rear seat observer with them in the fighters, they had to learn how to actually do their own spotting and operate the radio at the same time. So there's a lot of training that went into that. Execution, like in most things in air war, is exhaustive training and courage and determination and execution. Improvise, organize, and execute.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I wanted, there you go. Wanted to ask about you mentioned the AR, the use of, by the Germans, of the AR-234 jet reconnaissance bomber. But
okay,
if it works so well, and that they used it to, really map out about the photograph and get a very good picture of, the Normandy battlefield. But I wonder if they could do that. How come? Why couldn't they use that, to figure out that FUSAG wasn't real, or to figure out where the Russians were, because the Russians really fooled them, with their deception operation around Bagration, and they had no idea where the real concentration. So I just wonder, why that plane couldn't be used there to kind of get through these deception operations.
Okay,
really
good question.
Let
me very quickly finish up your first question first.
Sure.
The Army, the light planes, the liaison planes that were landed, actually flown over, some of them, already were trained artillery spotters with the units they were supporting. So they already had the training to spot artillery. Their biggest problem was ground fire. The Spitfire problem, the Navy guys, their biggest problem was the occasional Messerschmitt that might make it through the cordon, and also ground fire. So ground fire is a big deal when you're spotting, because people don't like to get shot at by big guns, so they shoot back at spotter planes. But they were all well trained, and they executed courageously and with expertise. Now your second question had to do with the AR-234, which was a twin engine plane. Why wasn't it used to fly over England? Why wasn't it used? Basically because of range and serviceability. First of all, they couldn't get an airfield close enough to Normandy for most of the campaign to even take pictures. And also they had to find an airfield that wasn't knocked out. So they were delayed in getting there. And the other thing is their range was relatively short. They had to be within 100 miles of the target, essentially.
Wow.
So getting there when you've knocked out every airfield within 130 miles gets to be a problem. So they actually were able to fly with impunity. By the time they got to fly with impunity, the invasion had already succeeded. In terms of, France wasn't liberated, but we had too many GIs ashore, and I say GI, I include the Brits. Okay, I never want to be accused of ignoring the British in anything, but the plane was didn't have the range from bases in France to get into any significant depth into the UK, and also, of course, they had all that. They had a lot of flak along the south coast, and also they had an airfield recovery problem. And Hitler also said that also restricted their operations over water. So there were a lot of restrictions, and it was a mechanical restriction in that the engines themselves would only fly so many hours before they essentially melted. Then they had to be taken off the airplanes. The melted blades had to be replaced. Any damage done by the melted blades had to be repaired. So it had a very short service life. And so that's the reason why they weren't effective. By the time they actually took those pictures, the invasion was a fact. So all it was a document, essentially a documentary of the invasion. Now, the picture you saw of the British landing area, that was taken by an ME-109 converted into a reconnaissance. The Germans were flying those too, and actually that was a fairly effective little plane. But because they'd been pushed back so far, their planes couldn't get to target areas before they were no longer target areas, essentially. So they were ineffective, and a lot of times the Allies left things like the fake army group near London, or southeast of London. The Allies normally just left fake stuff exposed so the occasional penetrating reconnaissance plane could see it, because that was part of the deception. So the same with the fake fleets that I showed you. Those were night things, and the AR-234 was basically a day reconnaissance plane.
Yeah. And was the AR-234 used over the Eastern Front ever? Because I've never heard about it over there.
Not very much, because two reasons. First of all, security. They didn't want any of them falling into Russian hands.
Right.
They did after the war. And also range, because it's very, very deep, theater, obviously, in Eastern Europe. And they had adequate numbers of prop-driven reconnaissance planes. And the Russian Air Force, not nearly as proficient in shooting down reconnaissance airplanes as the RAF and later the U.S. Air Force was. Incidentally, while we're talking about that, the Army Air Force, U.S. Army Air Force, didn't really get a good night fighter until they borrowed some from the Brits. Those were Mosquitoes. The Black Widow, the P-61, beautiful airplane, but really wasn't operational until near the end of Overlord.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know that.
So anyway, there's so many things that I can't talk about because of time constraints, but that's why I'm trying to put in books. The fourth book, what we just talked about, the fourth book, a lot of what you ask about will be in the fourth book, including the development of the jets. It would have been very frustrating to be a German Air Force officer or pilot during World War II, because they were incredibly capable. They were incredibly well trained, incredibly determined, but their upper management was Bush League. So that really did help us out a lot. Goring should have gotten a Distinguished Service Medal for his efforts from us.
On that note, thanks, Alex, for the question, and thank you for our speaker for a great talk and generous Q&A. Again, the book is Thunder Over Normandy, How Allied Airmen Helped Liberate France from D-Day to Paris and Beyond by Colonel Joseph T. Molyson. Wonderful book. We hope to have you back, Joe, for the fourth book. Speaking of that, please join us next Saturday when historian Andrew Blackley will discuss his latest book, Welding the Trident, Admiral Raymond Spruant and America's Victory in the Pacific, which is the first biography of Admiral Spruant in more than 50 years and offers a fresh look at one of the most brilliant naval commanders of the Pacific War with new unearthed archival research. So definitely please join us for that. Until then, have a good week, and thank you, Joe, for another great talk, and thanks for the audience for tuning in.
Thank you, Greg.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.